I live in Tokyo now, having moved here 2 months ago to start a new life. The city is bustling, always moving, but the deeper I've sunk into my daily routine, the more I've begun to feel like just another faceless figure in the crowd. I work as a junior architect for a mid-sized firm. It's a step up from my last job, but the pressure is unrelenting. My days are filled with drafting plans, site visits, and meetings. It's exhausting, but it pays well enough. So, every morning, I take the subway to work, just like everyone else. Shin-Koiwa Station, where I board each day, is on the Chuo line. It's a busy part of the city, but it's also infamous. Not for any reason that would make a newcomer feel welcome, though. The station has a dark reputation. It's become notorious as a place where people come to end their lives. The locals call it Suicide Station, and over the years, countless individuals have stepped in front of the speeding trains. They say the station is cursed, that something about it draws people to despair. I first heard the rumors about Shin-Koiwa Station the week I started my new job. One of my co-workers mentioned it casually over lunch, telling me about the mirrors they had installed on the platform. Supposedly, if a person in distress looks into the mirrors just before jumping, it might snap them out of their suicidal thoughts, make them realize the gravity of their actions. I remember being skeptical at first, thinking it was just an urban legend to scare newcomers. But the more I listened to the stories, the more the station's dark history seemed undeniable. Still, I didn't think much of it. I was new to Tokyo, new to the grind of work, and the rumors felt like little more than whispers, stories told by the city's old-timers to frighten those who didn't know better. But then, just last week, I became a part of that story. It was early, just after dawn. I was running late, as usual, barely making it to Shin-Koiwa in time for the 7:23 a.m. train, the one that would take me to the city center for a meeting. The platform was empty, save for a few scattered commuters, most of whom seemed as tired as I felt. The station was quieter than usual that morning, with the usual hum of voices muted under the low, buzzing fluorescent lights. And that's when I saw her. She wasn't anyone remarkable at first glance. Just an ordinary woman, maybe 26 or 27, dressed in a dark coat that hung loosely around her thin frame, the kind of coat you might wear to blend in during a chilly morning commute. Her black heels clicked softly against the cold platform as she walked, but there was something disconcertingly wrong in the way she moved. Her eyes were distant, unfocused, like someone who had wandered into the wrong place and forgotten how they got there. She carried a large handbag, the leather creased and worn at the edges, but her grip on it was loose, almost as if she wasn't aware of it in her hand at all. She stood near the edge of the platform, her gaze fixed on the tracks, her face pale under the harsh station lights. At first, I thought she was just another commuter, waiting for her train. But then, I felt it, this deep, instinctual warning that something was terribly wrong. My body tensed, and I couldn't look away, even though every part of me screamed to move, to do something. I watched as she took another slow, deliberate step toward the edge of the platform. There was an unnatural slowness in her movements, as though she wasn't just walking, but being pulled forward, inch by inch. It wasn't just that she looked like she was contemplating the worst decision of her life. It was something colder, something other. Her eyes flickered up, briefly meeting mine, and in that split second, I saw it, the raw and filtered terror in her gaze. Her pupils were wide, her face frozen in a mask of absolute fear. She wasn't looking at the train. She wasn't even looking at the platform. She was looking at me, and then, as if my presence had triggered something, her lips parted. "Save me, please," she mouthed. The words didn't make a sound, but I felt them. A raw, desperate plea, one that dug into my chest with the force of 1,000 hands. My heart stopped, and I took a step forward, my mind screaming at me to help her. But it was too late. Before I could even comprehend what had just happened, she lurched forward and threw herself in front of the oncoming train. The screech of the brakes sliced through the air, agonizingly loud as the train fought to stop, but it was futile. A sickening, gut-wrenching thump echoed in my ears, followed by the deafening chaos of screams and metal grinding against metal. The other passengers around me panicked, some scattering, others frozen in terror, but I remained rooted to the spot, unable to move. I don't know how long I stood there, my eyes glued to the scene before me, but it felt like an eternity. The gruesome sight of her body, broken and twisted beneath the wheels of the train, replayed in my mind with brutal clarity. The blood, the flesh, the sharp, visceral images that I couldn't unsee. It was too much. I felt my stomach turn, my body rebelling against the overwhelming horror, but I couldn't look away. Eventually, they shut down the entire line. The train station became a blur of police officers, cleanup crews, and shaken commuters, but I felt disconnected from it all. I didn't know how to process what had just happened. We were all herded out of the station, waiting for buses to take us to our destinations. But the image of that woman, the terror in her eyes, the unnatural stillness of her body, the desperation in her silent plea, kept swirling in my head. It was like she was still there, standing next to me, even though I knew she wasn't. The chill didn't fade. As I waited for the bus, I tried to push the image out of my mind, but there was something else, something more. It hit me like a punch to the gut as I replayed the scene in my mind. The shadows. Just before she stepped forward, before the chaos erupted, there had been something wrong. The station's lights, which normally cast sharp, clear shadows from the pillars and kiosks, were behaving strangely. Her shadow was different. It stretched out in a way that shouldn't have been possible. It wasn't just a faint distortion of the platform lights. No, her shadow stretched forward, toward the edge of the platform. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It was as if the light was coming from behind her, from somewhere I couldn't see. The shadow stretched in a way that didn't make sense. I felt a strange unease curl in my stomach, and I couldn't shake the thought. What was that? I tried to tell myself it was nothing, that it was just my mind playing tricks after seeing such a traumatic event. But that gnawing feeling remained. It clung to me like an unwelcome presence, refusing to be ignored. Later that day, after I got to work, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The shadows, the way her mouth had formed those silent, desperate words, "Save me. Please." I had to know more. I couldn't rest until I understood. So I sat at my desk, unable to focus on anything else, and began searching for old news reports about Shin-Koiwa Station. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. There were dozens of reports, suicides, tragic deaths, all of them happening at this very station, over and over again. It seemed like the station had been a magnet for despair. Men, women, children, all from different walks of life. Some had even survived the fall only to be found weeks later, their bodies never quite the same. The stories were haunting, but the strangest part was that they all seemed to share the same pattern. They occurred during the early morning hours, just before the first trains of the day arrived. Almost every victim had been alone, isolated in their final moments. I scrolled through the stories, the sense of dread growing heavier with each click. It was as though the station itself had become a gateway to something beyond the ordinary, a place where people were lured into a dark fate they couldn't escape. But then I came across something that made my heart stop. It was an old forum post, buried in the depths of a thread titled Strange Occurrences at Shin-Koiwa Station. The post was dated years ago, and the user who wrote it was a former commuter who claimed to have witnessed something similar, something far worse than a simple suicide. According to the post, there were rumors among long-time commuters, whispers of an unnatural presence that lingered at Shin-Koiwa. The user spoke of strange shadows that moved of their own accord, shadows that seemed to slither and stretch in ways that didn't make sense. People reported feeling drawn to the edge of the platform, as if some invisible force was urging them to step closer. And worst of all, some claimed that the shadows weren't just figments of the mind, they were alive, feeding on the despair of those who stood on the platform. As I read through the post, a cold sweat broke out across my skin. This wasn't just a rumor. People had been talking about this for years, but it had been buried, dismissed as urban legend or coincidence. But now, everything I had witnessed, the woman's terrified expression, her unnatural shadow, the horrific photograph I'd found, suddenly seemed connected. But there was one detail that made my blood run cold. The user had warned, if you feel the pull, if you feel something tugging at you from the station, leave. It wants you. It chooses its victims, and once you feel its presence, it won't stop until it's claimed you. It was a chilling thought, but as I reread those words, something in my gut tightened. A memory stirred, something I hadn't paid attention to before. The unease I had felt in the days leading up to the suicide, the way my feet always seemed to lead me toward Shin-Koiwa Station without thinking. The faint sense that I was being called there, as if some invisible force was pulling me closer, drawing me toward the place of death. I tried to shake off the feeling, but it lingered, a quiet whisper in the back of my mind. It wasn't until I stumbled upon another piece of information that I fully understood. A photograph. It was taken just moments before a middle-aged man had thrown himself in front of the train. But what grabbed my attention wasn't his face, it was his shadow. In the corner of the photo, beneath the platform, a twisted arm reached out from the darkness, grabbing his ankle and pulling him toward the train. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something other, something wrong. The woman I had seen that morning hadn't jumped of her own volition. She wasn't making a choice. She wasn't in control. She was being dragged by something darker, something more sinister than I could have ever imagined. And it wasn't over. It was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for its next victim. I had to get out of there. The realization hit me hard. This thing, whatever it was, had already marked me. I had felt it, hadn't I? The strange pull, the inexplicable attraction to Shin-Koiwa Station. How many times had I nearly walked there without thinking? How many times had I felt that same cold sensation on the back of my neck, as if something was watching me? I couldn't ignore it anymore. I couldn't keep taking the same route to work every morning. The feeling was growing stronger. I couldn't risk it. The next morning, instead of heading to Shin-Koiwa Station, I decided to take a different route to work. I didn't want to look back, didn't want to risk giving in to the pull, but the moment I stepped off the train at the new station, a part of me was already looking over my shoulder, expecting to see the dark shadow creeping closer, following me. The whole day felt wrong. Every time I passed a mirror, I swore I saw the outline of something behind me, just out of view. My thoughts kept drifting back to Shin-Koiwa, the station I had left behind. It was only a matter of time before it came for me. The feeling hadn't gone away. It was still there, lurking in the background, waiting for me to let my guard down. And I knew, deep down, that no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape. The thing that haunted Shin-Koiwa Station, the dark force that dragged people into its grasp, was already closer than I realized. It was waiting,